Millions of people died, empires burned, civilizations collapsed, and in almost every single case, the outcome came down to one thing: information. Who had it, who didn't, who lied about it, and who died because of it. Now imagine, just for a moment, that someone handed a general on a blood-soaked battlefield a machine that could predict the future, decode every enemy secret, and never, ever make a human mistake. History would not look anything like what you learned in school. Tonight, we're going to find out exactly what would have changed. Hey guys, welcome back. Get comfortable, get your blanket, maybe turn the lights down a little. Because tonight we are going somewhere genuinely fascinating. We are not doing a traditional history lesson. This is not your textbook. This is something that I personally find myself thinking about at like 2 a.m, when I probably should be sleeping, which honestly is how most of my best ideas happen anyway. Tonight's question is this: what if AI existed during history's greatest wars? Not AI like your phone auto-correcting your text into something embarrassing. Not AI like a chatbot telling you the weather. We're talking about the kind of artificial intelligence that exists right now, in the real world, in 2025. The kind that can process millions of data points per second, decode encrypted messages, predict enemy troop movements, run military simulations, optimize supply chains, and basically do everything that an entire army of generals, spies, and strategists used to do over weeks and months. Except this machine does it in an afternoon over a cup of coffee that it definitely doesn't need to drink. And we're going to apply that to 5 of history's most legendary, most catastrophic, most world-defining wars. We're going to look at what actually happened, why it happened, what the turning points were, and then, this is the fun part. We're going to think through what would have been different if someone in that war had access to a modern AI military system. Because here's the thing: most wars in history were not decided by bravery alone. They were not decided purely by the number of soldiers or the sharpest swords or the biggest cannons. More often than you'd think, wars were decided by bad information, slow communication, human error, and catastrophically bad decisions made by people who were either exhausted, overconfident, underinformed, or just genuinely not very good at their jobs. And that is where AI changes everything. Because AI does not get tired. It does not get scared. It does not have an ego. It does not make the same mistake twice. It does not ignore data because it doesn't match what it already believes. So, let's begin. We're going to move through 5 conflicts tonight, and I want you to settle in because we are not rushing through any of these. Each one deserves proper attention. Each one has layers. Each one has a moment, sometimes several moments, where the entire course of human history balanced on a knife's edge, and a decision was made by a human being who was just wrong. Our 5 wars tonight are World War II, the Mongol Invasions of the 13th century, the legendary Trojan War, the Napoleonic Wars, specifically that beautiful disaster at Waterloo, and finally, the American Civil War. 5 wars, 5 completely different eras, 5 completely different technologies, 5 moments where the world changed forever. And tonight, we ask the question that nobody in those moments had the luxury of asking. What if the machine had been there? Let's start at the very beginning of our list. And there is really no better place to start than the conflict that defined the entire modern world as we know it, World War II. Now I know. You've heard about World War II 1,000 times. You've seen the movies, you've done the school reports, you've watched the documentaries. But stay with me here, because we are not going to just retell the story. We are going to look at it from a very specific angle. The angle of intelligence, information, and decision-making, because that is where AI would have mattered most. And when you look at it through that lens, this war looks completely different from what you remember. Let me set the scene for you. It's the late 1930s. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, has been quietly rebuilding its military in violation of every treaty it signed after World War I. And here's where the first information failure begins. The British, the French, the Americans, they all had intelligence. They had spies. They had diplomatic reports. They had economic data showing Germany was rearming at an extraordinary pace. And yet, somehow, the political leaders of the Western world looked at all of that information and decided that appeasement was the smart play. That, if they just gave Hitler what he wanted, a little piece of Czechoslovakia here, a little acknowledgement there, he would calm down and everything would be fine. Of course, he didn't calm down, because that was never going to happen. And if you had fed all of that intelligence data, every diplomatic communication, every economic indicator, every troop movement report, every internal memo from the German government into a modern AI strategic analysis system, it would have told you within about 45 minutes that appeasement was not going to work. Not because the AI is psychic, but because the patterns were there. The historical precedent was there. Every single data point pointed in one direction. The human leaders chose to look away. The machine would not have been able to look away. It doesn't know how. So already, before a single major battle has been fought, AI changes the calculus entirely. The war might have been prevented, or at minimum, the Allied nations would have been far more militarily prepared when Germany finally made its move. But let's say the war happens anyway, because maybe the political will for prevention still wasn't there, even with better information. History is complicated like that. Okay, so the war begins. Germany invades Poland in September 1939. France and Britain declare war, and now we are in the thick of it. The next major turning point that AI would have absolutely demolished is something called the Battle of France, in May and June of 1940. This is one of the most shocking military outcomes in all of modern military history, and it is shocking precisely because of how completely the Allies were outsmarted. Not outgunned, outsmarted. The conventional military thinking at the time said that the Germans, if they invaded France, would do it the same way they did in World War I. They would come through Belgium, push west, and the Allies would stop them along the well-fortified northern border. The Allies built their entire defensive strategy around this assumption. They positioned their best troops in the north. They felt pretty good about their chances. And then the Germans did something that nobody in the Allied command seriously considered. They sent their main armored force through the Ardennes forest, a densely wooded, hilly region that military experts had declared essentially impassable for tanks. The French commander even reportedly said the Ardennes was impenetrable. So naturally, the Germans penetrated it. Within 6 weeks, France, one of the great military powers of Europe, had fallen. The British army was evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk by what was essentially a flotilla of civilian boats. It was one of the most dramatic and desperate moments of the entire war, and it happened largely because the Allied leadership had made an assumption, a very human assumption, and built their entire strategy around it, without seriously questioning it. Here's where the AI counterfactual gets really interesting. A modern AI military intelligence system would have been tracking German logistics movements in the weeks leading up to the invasion. It would have noted the unusual concentration of fuel supplies, engineering equipment, and tank units near the Ardennes sector. It would have cross-referenced that with German military doctrine, with terrain analysis data, with historical records of surprise military innovations. and it almost certainly would have flagged the Ardennes as a high-probability attack vector. Not because it's magic, because the data was there. The fuel trucks don't lie. The supply chains don't lie. The troop positions don't lie. Humans can rationalize away inconvenient data. Machine learning systems do not rationalize. They just see the pattern. So in an AI-assisted Allied command, the Battle of France likely looks very different. The French armies are more evenly distributed. The Ardennes sector is reinforced. The German armored breakthrough, the famous blitzkrieg that shocked the world, runs into a prepared defensive line instead of a gap in the Allied defenses. The battle drags on. Germany does not conquer France in 6 weeks. And if France doesn't fall, you don't get the Battle of Britain. You don't get the North African campaign the way it happened. You don't get 2 more years of German dominance in Western Europe. The entire trajectory of the war shifts right there in the spring of 1940. And we haven't even gotten to the Eastern Front yet. We haven't gotten to Enigma. We haven't gotten to Stalingrad. We are just getting started. So we left off with France. Germany has just done the unthinkable. Rolled tanks through a forest that the best military minds in Europe swore was impossible to cross with armor. And now the map of Western Europe looks very different from what it did 6 months earlier. But even with France occupied and Britain standing more or less alone, Hitler makes his next great and genuinely bizarre strategic decision. He turns east. Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. The largest military invasion in all of human history. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, all launched in a single coordinated assault across a nearly 2,000-mile front into the Soviet Union. Now here's the thing. This invasion, the one that most historians will tell you, is the single biggest strategic blunder of the entire war, was not a secret. Not really. Not if you were paying attention to the right information. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had been warned. He had been warned by his own intelligence services. He had been warned by British intelligence, who were reading German communications, thanks to their work at Bletchley Park. He had been warned by a Soviet spy network. He had been warned by a German defector. He had been warned by literally multiple independent sources, all saying the same thing. Germany is going to invade. The date is coming. Get ready. Stalin ignored all of it, and this is one of those moments in history where you just sit with it for a second and feel the weight of what one person's stubbornness can cost. Because Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler would not be irrational enough to open a 2-front war, while Britain was still undefeated. He believed the intelligence reports were either wrong or were deliberate disinformation planted by the British to drag the Soviet Union into the conflict. And so, he did nothing. He actually punished some of the officers who tried to warn him. When the German invasion came, the Soviet Red Army was catastrophically unprepared. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, the Germans captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many of them still on the ground, and advanced at a pace that had the German high command genuinely believing the war in the East would be over by Christmas. It wasn't, obviously. But the first phase of Barbarossa was a military catastrophe for the Soviets of almost incomprehensible scale. Now, drop a modern AI intelligence aggregation system into Stalin's command center in the spring of 1941. What happens? The system is receiving the same raw intelligence that Stalin's human analysts were receiving. The British warnings, the spy reports, the troop movement data, the economic indicators showing German oil reserves being stockpiled near the eastern border. The AI threat assessment algorithm does not care about Stalin's personal theory that Hitler wouldn't be irrational. It doesn't have a theory. It has data, And the data says, invasion probability, very high. Estimated timeline, within 60 days. Recommended response, immediate defensive mobilization of forward units, dispersal of aircraft, fortification of supply depots. The Soviet Union mobilizes. The German surprise attack, the cornerstone of the entire Barbarossa strategy, fails. Because surprise is the variable that changes everything in that opening phase. Without surprise, the German advance slows dramatically. Without that catastrophic early collapse, the Soviets retain more of their military infrastructure. The war in the East becomes a grinding, costly slog from day one instead of the early German blitzkrieg, followed by a painful Soviet recovery. And a slower, more costly war in the East means Germany is exhausted sooner, which means the timeline of the entire conflict compresses and shifts in the Allies' favor. But there is another dimension to the AI and World War II question that we absolutely cannot skip, and it is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of wartime intelligence. I'm talking about the work done at Bletchley Park, about the Enigma machine, and about a man named Alan Turing. Here's the basic story, in case you're not familiar. The Germans used a mechanical encryption device called the Enigma machine to encode all of their military communications. Every order, every troop movement, every submarine patrol route, all of it was encrypted by Enigma. And for a while, the Germans were completely confident that Enigma was unbreakable. The math said it should have been. The number of possible settings was so astronomically large that brute force decryption was considered impossible. And then Alan Turing, working with a team of brilliant mathematicians and code breakers in a secret facility in the English countryside, built a machine, the Bomba, that could systematically work through Enigma's possible configurations and find the daily settings. It was not AI in the modern sense, but it was computational intelligence applied to a problem that human brains could not solve fast enough to be useful. And the intelligence it produced, codenamed Ultra, is credited by many historians with shortening the war by 2 to 4 years. Now imagine that instead of Alan Turing's 1940s mechanical bomba, the Allies had a modern AI cryptography system. The difference is staggering. The bomba took hours, sometimes most of the day, to find the daily Enigma settings. A modern AI decryption algorithm would do that in seconds. Every German military communication, every U-boat patrol order, every Panzer Division movement, every strategic planning memo, decoded in real time. The German military machine, which relied so heavily on its encrypted communications, would have been functionally transparent to the Allied command. Every plan, known before it was executed, every ambush, anticipated, every supply convoy, intercepted before it sailed. In this scenario, the Battle of the Atlantic, the brutal, years-long struggle to keep Allied supply lines to Britain open against German submarine warfare, becomes almost a non-event. The U-boats, whose entire operational success depended on surprise and concealment, are found and sunk with brutal efficiency because their orders are being read before they leave port. Britain does not face the same devastating supply shortages. American war materials flow freely across the ocean. The Allied buildup for the eventual invasion of Europe is faster, better supplied, and launched sooner. And then there is D-Day, the greatest amphibious military operation in history. June 6th, 1944, the Normandy landings. This is another area where AI changes the picture significantly, but in a slightly more complicated way. Because actually, one of the most impressive intelligence operations in history was already running on the Allied side, the double-cross system, where British intelligence had turned virtually every German spy in Britain into a double agent, was feeding Hitler false information about where and when the invasion would land. The Germans were convinced, right up until it was too late, that Normandy was a feint, and the real invasion was coming at Pas de Calais. This deception, Operation Fortitude, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and disinformation, but it was also fragile. It depended on maintaining a web of lies through human agents, any one of whom might have cracked, made a mistake, or been exposed. With a modern AI deception management system, that web of lies becomes nearly airtight. The AI tracks every piece of disinformation being fed to the enemy, models how the enemy is processing it, identifies inconsistencies before they become visible, and adjusts the story in real time to make it more convincing. The German high command stays confused longer, reinforces the wrong beach, and the D-Day landings succeed with significantly lower casualties. The war ends sooner. The liberation of Europe comes faster. Fewer people die. History changes. And that is just World War II. One war, 5 points of divergence, and we've really only scratched the surface. We could spend this entire video on World War II alone, and honestly, the YouTube channel Tick History has done incredible work breaking down the Eastern Front in ways that will absolutely keep you up past midnight if you're not careful. But tonight, we have 4 more wars to get through, so let's slowly move to our next one. Alright, we are now traveling back, way back. We're leaving the 20th century entirely, putting down the tanks and the submarines and the encrypted radio transmissions, and we are going to the 13th century. To a moment in history that is honestly one of the most fascinating and terrifying things that has ever happened to the human species, the Mongol Invasions. If you've never really spent time with this chapter of world history, I want you to know that your brain is about to do something uncomfortable, which is try to process a scale of military conquest that genuinely has no parallel in all of recorded history. Not the Romans, not Alexander the Great, not Napoleon, not anyone. The Mongol Empire at its peak controlled more land than any empire before or since, and it was built almost entirely through military conquest in a relatively short period of time by people who started out as nomadic herders on the Central Asian steppe. Let's talk about how they did it, because understanding that is essential to understanding where AI would have mattered. And then we'll talk about where the whole thing eventually broke down. It starts with Genghis Khan, born sometime around 1162 in what is now Mongolia, into a world of constant tribal warfare, betrayal, and survival of the fittest politics that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's birthday party. His name wasn't even Genghis Khan when he was born. That was a title he gave himself, roughly meaning universal ruler, which is the kind of name you give yourself when you've already conquered enough of the world to feel justified about it. His birth name was Temujin. What Genghis Khan built was not just a large army. What he built was a revolutionary military command and control system that was, for its era, genuinely decades ahead of everyone else. He organized his army on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, with clear chains of command, clear responsibilities, and clear communication protocols. He used a relay messenger system called the Yam, a network of horse stations spread across his territory. That could transmit a message across thousands of miles, faster than any rival empire could move information. He promoted officers based on merit, not birth. He integrated conquered peoples into his military structure instead of just slaughtering them, which both solved the manpower problem and got him access to specialists, engineers, siege experts, navigators, that nomadic Mongols didn't naturally produce. He was, in other words, running a data and logistics optimization operation that would have made a modern military strategist nod slowly and say, yeah, okay, that's actually pretty smart. and the campaigns his forces ran were relentlessly, terrifyingly effective. They had a scouting and intelligence network that often knew more about their enemies' military dispositions than the enemies knew about themselves. Before a major campaign, Mongol scouts, sometimes operating years in advance, would infiltrate target regions, map roads and rivers and fortifications, assess grain stocks, identify political divisions, and report back. It was slow by modern standards, obviously, but for the 13th century, it was extraordinary. Now, when we talk about where AI would have changed the Mongol invasions, we actually have to look at it from two directions. Because the Mongols were so militarily dominant in the first half of the 13th century that you almost have to ask, would AI help them more, or would it help their enemies more? Let's look at their first major setback, because the Mongols did have setbacks. They were not literally invincible. They just had a very good run for a very long time. The first time the Mongol war machine hit a real wall was in Japan, twice. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, who at this point ruled the largest land empire in the world, decided in the 1270s that Japan needed to become part of that empire. And so he launched an invasion. Two of them, in fact, the first in 1274, the second in 1281. Both failed, and they failed largely because of a factor that no amount of Mongol military intelligence could fully account for: weather, specifically a typhoon. In 1281, a massive typhoon struck the Mongol fleet as it sat off the coast of Japan, waiting to support the land invasion, and essentially destroyed it. Thousands of soldiers drowned. The invasion collapsed. The Japanese called the typhoon the kamikaze, the divine wind, and believed it to be a divine intervention, protecting their islands. Now, an AI weather prediction system, even a relatively modest one by modern standards, would have identified the conditions developing in the Pacific that summer as dangerous to the fleet. It would have recommended either accelerating the landing before the storm arrived, repositioning the fleet to a sheltered harbor, or delaying the operation entirely until the weather window improved. The fleet doesn't get destroyed. The invasion possibly continues. Japan's history changes entirely. No isolation policy, no centuries of self-contained development, no feudal samurai culture as we know it, at least not in the same form. The butterfly effect of that one decision ripples forward through 800 years of Asian history and global history. But the more philosophically interesting question is this: what if an AI-assisted defender had been standing against the Mongols during the height of their conquests in the 1200s? Let's look at the Mongol invasion of the Islamic world, specifically the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Because this is one of those events in history that genuinely makes you feel something quiet and sad, even 800 years later. Baghdad in 1258 was one of the greatest cities in the world. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of learning, science, philosophy, and literature that had been accumulating knowledge for 5 centuries. The House of Wisdom, a legendary institution that housed translations of Greek philosophy, advances in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, was one of the intellectual treasures of civilization. The city had a population of perhaps 800,000 people. The Mongol army under Hulagu Khan arrived in January 1258 and laid siege to the city. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, made a series of catastrophic decisions. He underestimated the size of the Mongol force. He rebuffed offers of negotiation. He sent an army out to engage the Mongols in the open field, exactly what the Mongols wanted, because fighting in the open against Mongol cavalry and archers was essentially choosing to lose. And he failed to gather reinforcements from neighboring Islamic states in time. Within about 2 weeks, the The city fell. What followed was the siege of Baghdad and its aftermath, one of the most devastating events in medieval history. The city was sacked, and the destruction of the accumulated knowledge in its libraries is considered by many historians as a catastrophic, irreversible blow to the scientific and intellectual development of the Islamic Golden Age. An AI-assisted Abbasid command would have done several things differently. Starting months earlier, it would have been tracking the Mongol army's movements, size, and logistics through a network of scouts and informants, processing that data into an accurate threat assessment. Instead of underestimating the force, the Caliph receives a clear, unambiguous picture. This army is approximately 100,000 strong. It has successfully reduced numerous fortified cities, and frontal engagement in open terrain is not survivable. The AI recommends a negotiated surrender or a prolonged siege defense, while reinforcements are sought from Egypt and other allied powers. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which would eventually defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, gets pulled into the defense of Baghdad earlier. The city might survive. 800 years of accumulated knowledge might survive. History, once again, decided to be dramatic in the most inconvenient way. But the machine would have seen it coming. All right, so we've come through the 20th century and the 13th, and now I want to take us somewhere even further back. We're going all the way to the ancient world, to a war that is so old, so mythologized, so wrapped in legend and poetry and divine intervention, that for a long time people weren't even sure it actually happened. The Trojan War. And yes, I know, the Trojan War sits in a very unusual position when it comes to discussing military history and technology, because depending on which version of events you subscribe to, it involves gods actively participating in the conflict, a woman whose face literally launched 1,000 ships, a horse that is the most famous piece of military deception in human history, and a war that supposedly lasted 10 years over an argument that started at a wedding where someone didn't get invited. So, pretty standard ancient geopolitics, really. Let me give you the shape of the story first, because the details matter for our question. The traditional account, drawn primarily from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the surrounding body of Greek mythology, goes like this. Paris, a prince of Troy, visits Sparta and is treated as a guest by the Spartan king Menelaus. He then, depending on whether you believe he seduced her or abducted her, leaves with Helen, the king's wife, who was famously considered the most beautiful woman in the world. Menelaus, understandably not thrilled about this, calls on his brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in the Greek world, to help him get his wife back. Agamemnon, who never met an excuse to launch a military campaign he didn't love, assembles a coalition of Greek city-states and sails for Troy with a fleet of 1,000 ships. And then the war begins. And here is where the situation becomes genuinely fascinating from a military strategy standpoint, because what follows is almost a decade of siege warfare that goes essentially nowhere. The Greeks camp outside the walls of Troy for 10 years. 10 years. There are raids and skirmishes and individual combats between champions, and a lot of divine meddling from Zeus and Hera and Apollo and everyone else on Olympus, who apparently has nothing better to do. But the city doesn't fall, because Troy's walls are famously impregnable, and the Trojans are content to stay behind them. Let's just think about that for a second from a modern perspective. You are trying to take a walled city. The city has a reliable water supply. The city has food stockpiles. The city has allies who occasionally resupply it. And your army is sitting outside in tents for 10 years. The Greek coalition is essentially hemorrhaging resources, manpower, and morale for a decade, without a coherent plan to actually break the stalemate. They are just hanging around being Greek, which involved a great deal of feasting, arguing, and occasionally fighting each other, as well as the enemy, which, of course, they did. Achilles spent a significant chunk of the war refusing to fight because Agamemnon took his prize. As you do, an AI strategic planning system dropped into the Greek command would have been alarmed by this situation within approximately the first fiscal quarter of the siege. Day 1. Analysis. Current strategy of indefinite encirclement is unsustainable. Projected resource depletion timeline based on current consumption rates versus available supply. 3 to 4 years before coalition collapse from attrition. Recommendation: develop an alternative approach to neutralizing the city's defensive advantage, which eventually the Greeks did figure out, just, 10 years later than necessary. The Trojan horse, the most famous piece of military deception in recorded history, and arguably the single greatest social engineering attack ever executed in any era. The concept, for anyone who needs a refresher: the Greeks pretend to abandon the siege, sail away, and leave behind a gigantic wooden horse as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, believing the war is over and feeling quite pleased with themselves for having survived it, drag the horse inside their walls. At night, a small group of Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse climb out, open the city gates, and the Greek fleet, which had only sailed out of sight, not actually home, returns. The city falls in a night. It's elegant, it's audacious, and it represents an understanding of human psychology and behavioral prediction that was genuinely sophisticated for its time. The Greeks understood that after 10 years of war, the Trojans would be emotionally primed to believe what they wanted to believe. They wanted the war to be over. They wanted to have won. So they saw a large wooden horse and thought, gift. Not extremely suspicious tactical device filled with armed men. Now, how does AI change the Trojan War? From the Greek side, an AI logistics and strategy system would have identified the correct approach, finding an indirect method to neutralize the walls rather than a prolonged direct siege. Far earlier than year 10, it might not have invented the horse specifically, but it would have been running probability simulations on various approaches: infiltration, internal subversion of the Trojan court, targeting supply routes, exploiting political tensions within the city. Troy was not a monolithic entity. There were Trojans, like Cassandra, who thought the whole situation was a disaster from the start, and whose warnings were consistently ignored. An AI might have identified and exploited those internal fractures years earlier. But here is the truly interesting side. What if Troy had the AI? Because the Trojan side of this story is in some ways the more tragic one. The Trojans had multiple warning signs about the horse. Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam, the original prophet who nobody listened to, warned explicitly that the horse was a trap. She had already warned, correctly, about multiple disasters throughout the war, and been ignored every single time. A priest named Laocoon also warned against bringing the horse inside, famously saying something along the lines of, "I fear the Greeks even when they bear gifts," which is where we get that phrase. He then got killed by divine-sent sea serpents for his trouble, which convinced everyone else that the gods wanted them to bring the horse in. So, yeah, a Trojan AI threat analysis system would not have been persuaded by sea serpents. It would have run the probability assessment on the horse without the emotional and religious context. A wooden structure this size, left by an enemy force that abandoned its siege prematurely, without a peace treaty, without negotiation, without the return of hostages or property, represents an anomaly, Anomalies should be investigated before being introduced into secured territory. Standard military protocol. The horse gets examined. The Greeks inside are discovered. The war ends differently. And possibly the most interesting version of this story is the one where both sides have access to AI warfare systems. Because what you get in that scenario is an AI arms race in a Bronze Age context, each side's system trying to outmaneuver the others. The Greek AI designs a deception. The Trojan AI detects the deception. The Greek AI adapts the deception. And suddenly the 10-year war of attrition becomes a sophisticated, high-speed intelligence duel that looks nothing like anything Homer could have imagined. And as expected, history was not done being dramatic. So let's continue forward. From the ancient world, we're jumping ahead about 2,000 years, skipping a great deal of equally interesting history, and landing in the early 19th century, in Europe, in a period that is, in many ways, the bridge between the ancient way of making war and the modern one. We are talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. Specifically, we are talking about Waterloo, the battle that ended everything. But before we get to Waterloo, I need to give you some context about who Napoleon was and why he matters so much to this conversation. Because Napoleon is not just a famous historical figure. He was, arguably, one of the most effective military commanders in the history of the human race. And a significant part of what made him effective was something that sounds very relevant to our theme tonight. He was, essentially, a human data processor. I know that sounds strange, so let me explain. Napoleon's military genius was built on a very specific skill set. He had an extraordinary ability to hold large amounts of information in his head simultaneously. Troop positions, terrain features, weather conditions, supply situations, the location and condition of every unit in his army, and synthesize all of that into rapid, decisive action. His subordinate commanders often said that he seemed to know things about the battlefield that he shouldn't have been able to know, because he processed information faster and more accurately than anyone around him. He was also obsessed with speed and logistics. His famous quote, "An army marches on its stomach," is not just a catchy line. It reflects a deep, systematic understanding of the relationship between military supply chains, operational tempo, and battlefield outcome. He revolutionized the way European armies moved and fought, using corps-level organization, essentially self-contained mini-armies that could operate independently and then concentrate for a decisive battle, in ways that his enemies, fighting with older, more rigid organizational structures, consistently struggled to respond to. What AI would have done for Napoleon is almost unfair to contemplate, because in many ways, what Napoleon was doing manually, synthesizing battlefield information, optimizing logistics, predicting enemy responses, is precisely what modern AI military systems are designed to do. Napoleon was a human approximation of a machine that hadn't been invented yet. If you had given him the actual machine, the actual real-time battlefield management AI, history does not just change. History might have ended with a very different map of the world. But here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about why Napoleon lost. Because he had, by the time of Waterloo in June of 1815, lost several key campaigns. He had been exiled, returned from exile, raised an army, and launched his final campaign, the 100 Days, with characteristic boldness and characteristic speed. And at Waterloo, on June 18th, 1815, he had, on paper, a reasonable chance of winning. He faced two separate Allied armies, the British-led force under the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. That had not yet fully united. His plan was to defeat them separately before they could combine. Standard Napoleonic doctrine. It had worked before. It did not work this time, and it did not work for a specific, identifiable set of reasons. all of which come back to information and timing. Reason 1. Napoleon delayed the start of the battle at Waterloo by several hours on the morning of June 18th, waiting for the ground to dry after overnight rain, so his artillery could maneuver. This delay gave Blücher's Prussian army crucial extra hours to march to Wellington's assistance. It was a judgment call. The AI running Napoleon's command would have been calculating, in real time, the trade-off between artillery effectiveness and the probability of Prussian arrival based on their last known position and likely march rate. It might very well have recommended beginning the attack earlier, accepting slightly reduced artillery effectiveness in exchange for preventing Prussian reinforcement. That single timing change potentially decides the battle. Reason 2. Ney's charge. Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's most celebrated commanders, arguably the bravest soldier in Europe, led a series of massive cavalry charges against the British infantry squares at Waterloo that were, from a tactical standpoint, almost puzzlingly poorly managed. He launched the charges without proper infantry support, without artillery preparation, at the wrong time and in the wrong formation. The British squares held. The charges failed. Thousands of French cavalrymen and horses died for essentially nothing. An AI tactical command system on the French side would never have approved those charges in that configuration. The data is clear. Unsupported cavalry against formed infantry in square does not work. The casualty projections are prohibitive. The probability of success is low. Recommendation: coordinate combined arms assault, artillery, infantry, and cavalry together, or do not assault at all. Ney's bravery was extraordinary. His judgment at that moment was not. The machine has no bravery and no ego. It just has the numbers. And the numbers said no. Reason 3. Communications. Throughout the day at Waterloo, Napoleon received inconsistent, delayed, and in some cases incorrect information about what was happening across his front. The fog of war, the ancient, universal problem of military commanders not knowing in real time what is happening to their forces, was a constant, crippling factor. At one point, Napoleon received a report that suggested his right flank was secure, when it was, in fact, beginning to collapse under Prussian pressure. That incorrect information shaped his decisions for a critical window of time. A real-time AI battlefield monitoring system does not send Napoleon the wrong report. It synthesizes data from every unit, their positions, their ammunition states, their casualty rates, the pressure they are under, into a continuously updated battlefield awareness picture. Napoleon sees the right flank beginning to crumble while he still has reserves to respond. He commits those reserves to shore up the flank before the collapse becomes irreversible. The Battle of Waterloo goes differently. Now, I want to be careful here about what differently means, because I think the most honest answer is, we don't know exactly. Wellington and Blücher were both extraordinarily capable commanders. Wellington in particular was one of history's great defensive generals. If Napoleon had AI and Wellington did not, probably Napoleon wins Waterloo. But if both sides had access to equivalent AI military technology, and remember, Wellington had a massive intelligence network of his own, and the British were already very good at signals intelligence, then what you get is a much closer fight, determined at the margins by terrain, numbers, and the thousand small variables that make any battle unique. And that is, actually, the most interesting answer. Not AI makes Napoleon unstoppable, but AI makes the fight more perfectly even, which means the outcome might have been determined by something even smaller, even more random than it was. History has a way of finding the crack where chaos can get in, no matter how perfect the information system. All right, We've been on quite the journey tonight. Ancient Greece, the steppes of Central Asia, Nazi Germany, Napoleonic France. And now we are coming home, in a sense, because our final war is one that happened right here, on American soil, among Americans, which makes it, in some ways, the most personally resonant conflict on our list tonight, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. 4 years that killed more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history, including both world wars combined. A war that was about slavery. Let's be honest and clear about that, even in a calm, late-night storytelling context, and about whether the United States of America was actually going to remain united. A war that produced some of the most brilliant and some of the most catastrophically flawed military leadership that the continent has ever seen. And a war that, perhaps more than any of our other examples tonight, illustrates the way that information technology, even primitive information technology, directly shapes strategic outcomes. Because here's something that a lot of people don't think about. When they think about the Civil War, it was the first major conflict in history to be significantly shaped by the electric telegraph. For the first time, a military commander could communicate with units hundreds of miles away in real time, or at least near real time. For the first time, news of a battle could reach the capital in hours rather than days. For the first time, strategic coordination over vast distances was genuinely possible in ways it had never been before. And this new technology was not used equally well by both sides. The Union, the North, ultimately used the telegraph network far more effectively than the Confederacy. President Lincoln himself famously spent many nights in the War Department telegraph office, reading intercepted Confederate messages and monitoring the progress of his generals in near real time. He was, in a very real sense, practicing a primitive form of what we would now call C4 ISR: command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. He was trying to solve the same problem that modern AI military systems are designed to solve. How do you have accurate, timely, situational awareness over an enormous, complex, dynamic battlefield? Lincoln was not a military man by training, but he understood information, and he understood that his generals frequently did not have the information they needed to make good decisions. His frustration with General George McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, in the early war years, is one of the most documented examples of information failure in Civil War history. McClellan was a superb organizer. He built the Army of the Potomac from a disorganized, demoralized force into a genuine military machine, and then he consistently refused to use it because he always believed, wrongly, almost every time, that he was outnumbered by Confederate forces. The reason McClellan believed this was a man named Allan Pinkerton. Pinkerton, founder of the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, ran McClellan's intelligence operation, and Pinkerton was spectacularly bad at estimating Confederate troop strength. Systematically, consistently, dramatically bad. He routinely delivered estimates that placed Confederate forces at 2, 3, sometimes 4 times their actual numbers. McClellan, who was temperamentally cautious to begin with, received these inflated estimates and used them as justification for inaction. He wouldn't advance because he was outnumbered. Except he wasn't outnumbered. He was just receiving bad intelligence. A modern AI military intelligence system in McClellan's headquarters does not make Pinkerton's mistakes. It does not inflate enemy strength because of cognitive bias or misidentified units or double-counted troops. It cross-references multiple data sources, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, supply line analysis, and produces an enemy order of battle estimate that is, if not perfect, at least not wildly fictional. McClellan knows he has more men than Lee, not fewer. The Army of the Potomac advances when it should advance. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862, which McClellan fumbled away through excessive caution, might actually succeed. If the Union takes Richmond in 1862 instead of 1865, the war ends 3 years earlier. The death toll, which reached something like 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers, is a fraction of what it became. But the Civil War AI question has another dimension that is equally interesting, and it sits on the Confederate side of the ledger. Because the Confederacy produced one of the greatest military commanders in American history, Robert E. Lee. And Lee's genius, like Napoleon's, was built on something very close to what AI does: an extraordinary ability to read a battlefield, process information about enemy positions and intentions, and make rapid, audacious decisions that consistently caught his opponents off balance. Lee's greatest victories. Chancellorsville in 1863 is probably the most famous example, came from his ability to read his opponent's psychology and exploit it. At Chancellorsville, facing a Union army roughly twice the size of his own, Lee divided his already outnumbered force and sent Stonewall Jackson's corps on a long, concealed march around the Union right flank. It was an extraordinarily risky maneuver. If the Union commander, General Hooker, had used his significantly superior force aggressively at any point during Jackson's march, Lee could have been destroyed. But Lee knew Hooker. He read him correctly. He gambled that Hooker would hesitate, and Hooker hesitated, and Jackson's flank attack was a catastrophic surprise. An AI-assisted Union command at Chancellorsville would have been monitoring the Confederate column movement in real time through cavalry reconnaissance and signal intercept, feeding that data into a battlefield management system that would have flagged significant Confederate force movement detected on your right flank, recommend immediate reinforcement of that sector, and preparation for flank defense. Hooker gets the warning in time. Jackson's attack hits a prepared position instead of a surprised one. Lee's great gamble fails. Stonewall Jackson doesn't get wounded in the confusion after the battle and die shortly afterward. The entire 1863 Confederate campaign goes differently. Gettysburg, which happened 2 months later, might never have been necessary from Lee's perspective, or it might have happened under completely different circumstances. And then there is Gettysburg itself. 3 days in early July 1863 that decided the fate of the war as much as any single engagement. We could spend 3 hours on Gettysburg alone, and there are outstanding documentaries that do, Ken Burns's The Civil War being the most famous. But for tonight, let's just identify the key AI inflection point. Pickett's charge, July 3rd, 1863, in the afternoon. Lee ordered approximately 12,000 Confederate soldiers to march across approximately 3/4 of a mile of open ground against entrenched Union positions on Cemetery Ridge. It is one of the most controversial decisions in the history of American warfare. His subordinate commanders, including General Longstreet, knew it was almost certainly going to fail, and said so. The math was brutal. Men on foot crossing open ground against artillery and entrenched infantry, with no real chance of tactical surprise. The charge was repulsed with enormous Confederate casualties. It was the high water mark of the Confederacy, and the tide receded permanently after that afternoon. An AI strategic assessment system running Lee's options on the morning of July 3rd would have produced a casualty probability projection for a frontal assault on Cemetery Ridge that even the most aggressive gambler would have hesitated over. Probability of reaching enemy line with enough force to break it, very low. Projected casualties, catastrophic. Alternative options recommended. Defensive consolidation, strategic withdrawal, flank repositioning. Lee, famously, overruled his own best judgment and his best commanders that day. A machine doesn't get overruled. It just keeps showing you the numbers until you either listen or you don't. We've now walked through all 5 of our wars. World War II, the Mongol Invasions, the Trojan War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Civil War. And I want to take a moment here, before we wrap up, to step back and look at the bigger picture, because I think there are some patterns in what we've been talking about tonight that are genuinely worth thinking about, and not just as an interesting intellectual exercise. The first pattern is this. In every single one of these conflicts, the decisive moments came down to information. Not always firepower, not always numbers, not always bravery. Information. Who had it? Who didn't? Who was wrong about it? And what decision was made on the basis of that wrong information? The French at the Ardennes didn't have the information that a German armor push was coming through. The Soviets at the start of Barbarossa had the information, but refused to process it correctly. The Trojans were told by Cassandra exactly what the horse was, and chose to ignore it because a divine signal told them otherwise. McClellan had inflated wrong information that made him timid when he should have been bold. Napoleon at Waterloo had delayed, fragmented information that cost him the battle, and the Mongols at Japan had no information about the weather that was about to destroy their fleet. Every one of these failures is an information processing failure at its core, and that is, precisely and specifically, what artificial intelligence is designed to fix. The second pattern is, human ego and emotion consistently interfered with good decision-making. Stalin couldn't accept information that contradicted his theory. Agamemnon couldn't stop his coalition from falling apart over personal disputes. McClellan was too cautious and too prideful to act on incomplete information with confidence. Lee was too aggressive when caution was called for. Napoleon's marshals let personal bravado override tactical common sense. These are not criticisms, really. These are just observations about what human beings do under pressure. We have egos. We have fears. We have theories we don't want to give up. We have emotions that color our judgment. AI does not have any of these things. It has priors and weightings that can be biased if the training data is biased. That's a real issue. But it does not have a wounded pride that stops it from reconsidering a position. It doesn't have a psychological need to believe that the enemy is not really about to invade. This is the most profound implication of AI warfare, I think. Not the drones, not the encrypted communications, not the logistics optimization, though all of those are enormous. It's the removal of ego from strategic decision-making. Every general in history has had moments where they knew, on some level, that a decision was wrong, and made it anyway because of pride, or fear, or political pressure, or because they just couldn't face what the data was telling them. The machine does not have that problem. And the third pattern, which is perhaps the most humbling, is this. AI doesn't guarantee victory. It changes the odds. It changes the margins. It reduces the probability of catastrophic, avoidable errors. But it does not remove chance from the equation entirely. History is full of moments that were decided by things no intelligent system, human or artificial, could have predicted or controlled. A storm off the coast of Japan, a chance encounter between cavalry scouts in the Maryland countryside that starts the Battle of Antietam, a single bullet fired in Sarajevo. AI systems can model uncertainty. They can give you probability distributions. They can say, there is a significant chance of rain during your invasion. You should consider a delay. But they cannot control the universe. They cannot prevent the random chaos that is always lurking at the edges of even the best laid plans. What they can do, and this is genuinely significant, is dramatically reduce the number of times a conflict is decided by dumb, avoidable, preventable mistakes. And when you look at history and count how many millions of people died because of dumb, avoidable, preventable mistakes, that's not a small thing. There's also, of course, the dark side of this conversation, which I've been deliberately keeping to a minimum tonight because this is a calm, reflective storytelling channel and not a geopolitics anxiety seminar. But it would be intellectually dishonest not to mention it. AI warfare technology is real. It exists right now, in 2025. Multiple militaries around the world are actively developing and deploying AI-powered military systems for drone swarm coordination, autonomous targeting, cyber warfare, signals intelligence, predictive logistics. The questions we've been asking tonight in the context of ancient history are not just abstract thought experiments. They are, in a very real sense, the questions that defense ministries and military researchers and ethicists are grappling with right now. What happens when both sides in a future conflict have advanced AI military systems? We discussed this briefly in the Trojan War context. The idea of an AI arms race between two sides, each system adapting to the other's strategies in real time. That's not a hypothetical. That is essentially the direction in which modern military AI development is heading. And the implications are significant, to put it gently. If AI removes human error from warfare, does it make war more efficient and therefore more deadly? Or does it make war more rational and therefore less likely? Does an AI strategic system that can perfectly model the outcome of a conflict prevent that conflict from starting because it shows both sides that the result is not worth the cost? That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that an AI that makes you much better at fighting also makes the people who have it more willing to use it because the projected cost-benefit analysis looks more favorable from their side. I don't have a clean answer to that. History doesn't either, really. What history does tell us, pretty clearly and across thousands of years of evidence, is that better information has almost always been used, eventually, to make conflicts worse before it makes them better. The first person to understand that information is power was not trying to prevent war. They were trying to win one. But I think, and this is just me, sitting here at whatever hour it is, thinking about history the way I usually do, that there is something genuinely hopeful in the technology, if it's used right. Every war on our list tonight happened partly because someone was wrong about the enemy's intentions, about the terrain, about the weather, about the loyalty of allies, about the capabilities of their own forces. AI, used well, makes it harder to be that wrong. And being less wrong, over time, across enough decisions, might actually be the closest thing to wisdom that a civilization can engineer. That's a pretty heavy thought for a bedtime history video, I'll admit. But here we are. Let's slowly move toward wrapping this one up, because we have covered a genuinely enormous amount of ground tonight, and I don't want to rush the ending. What we've talked about is, fundamentally this: artificial intelligence would have been one of the most transformative forces in the history of human conflict, had it existed in any of these 5 eras. In World War II, it likely shortens the war by years and saves tens of millions of lives. In the Mongol Invasions, it gives defenders a fighting chance they barely had, and possibly saves one of history's greatest repositories of human knowledge. In the Trojan War, it cuts a 10-year siege down to something far shorter and far less wasteful. In the Napoleonic Wars, it either makes Napoleon genuinely unstoppable, or it levels the playing field in a way that makes the outcome genuinely uncertain. And in the American Civil War, it almost certainly ends the conflict faster, with fewer deaths on both sides. In every case, the fundamental change is the same. Less fog, less ignorance, less of that particular kind of tragedy that comes from a general making a decision based on information he was never going to have in time. And maybe that is the most human thing about all of this. Every one of these wars was, at its core, a story about people trying to navigate terrible uncertainty with incomplete information under enormous pressure, with the lives of thousands or millions hanging on their judgment. We call the great commanders heroes, and they were. But they were also doing something that was, by its nature, impossibly difficult, managing complexity that no human mind was ever really designed to manage. The machine was designed for exactly that, and it arrived about 2,500 years too late to save a lot of people a lot of grief. But it's here now, and what we do with it is, as always, entirely up to us. So, here we are, the end of the road, at least for tonight. We started with a hook about information. We ended in roughly the same place, and somewhere in between, we visited ancient Greece, medieval Central Asia, Nazi Germany, Napoleonic France, and the fields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. We asked the same question in 5 very different places. What if the machine had been there? And the answer, I think, is always the same at its core. The machine would have helped. It would have helped a lot. It would have saved lives, in numbers that are hard to even think about. Without feeling something, it would have shortened conflicts that dragged on for years, because of human stubbornness and human blindness and human fear. It would have seen the wooden horse for what it was. It would have read the supply train reports coming out of the Ardennes. It would have heard the warnings that Cassandra gave and treated them as data rather than inconvenient noise. But it would not have removed the human element entirely, because the human element is not just the source of all the mistakes. It's also the source of all the meaning. The decisions, even the wrong ones, were made by people who were trying, who were afraid, who wanted to win, or wanted to protect their people, or wanted to believe that the worst wasn't coming. And that's the paradox at the heart of this whole conversation. The very things that make human beings bad at war, our emotions, our egos, our biases, our need to believe what we want to believe, are the same things that make us human. And removing them from the equation doesn't just make war more efficient, it makes war less human, which might be a good thing for warfare and a complicated thing for everything else. I don't have a clean bow to tie on that. History never really gives you a clean bow to tie. It just gives you a story, and the story is always a little complicated, a little sad, a little absurd, and occasionally, if you're lucky, a little beautiful. If you enjoyed spending this evening drifting through history with me, from Troy to Normandy, from the steppes of Mongolia to the fields of Gettysburg, then maybe leave a like down below. It means more than you'd think, honestly. And if you want to keep doing this, keep following the long, strange, fascinating thread of what history was and what it might have been, then subscribe to Historian Museum. We do this every week. New stories, new questions, new rabbit holes to fall into at hours when you should probably be asleep. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Good night.